Hey everybody, I'm going to read over this review for the Civil War and Reconstruction test that you have tomorrow. I hope that you take the time to watch this tonight and then use the paper copy of what I'm going to read to you. Go to the link here or use the QR code to go to the Quizlet review after you watch this video. So if you'll follow along, at the top it says Civil War, and you can see the American flag, and it says the North was also known as the United States, the Union, the Yankees, and the Blue. Their uniforms were blue. And then we see two flags at the bottom. Those are both the Confederate flags, and the one on the right is better well known. And you'll see the South was known as the Confederate States, the Confederates, the rebels, and their uniforms were gray. Some important people to remember for the Civil War. Jefferson Davis, an American statesman and politician who then joined as President of the Confederate States of America for its entire existence from 1861 to 1865. John Bell Hood. This man tried unsuccessfully to draw Sherman out of Atlanta by moving back up through Tennessee and threatening an invasion of the North. Sherman sent troops to reinforce Nashville, and in the Battle of Nashville, the Union defeated him. Robert E. Lee, a former Union general, so he was a general in the United States Army before the Civil War. He joined the South after Virginia seceded because this was his home state, and he was put in charge of the Confederate Army and led it to many victories. Ulysses S. Grant, he was the head of the Union Army after he showed that he was very capable in the West, winning the Battle of Vicksburg. He was an American general and then the 18th President of the United States after the Civil War. He achieved international fame as the leading Union general in the American Civil War. John B. Magruder, Confederate colonel from Texas who won the Battle of Galveston. John Reagan, he was a Texan who showed hospitality to carpetbaggers in order to protect Texas during Reconstruction, the highest-ranking civilian in the Confederate government. Remember, a carpetbagger is literally somebody that took a piece of carpet, put all their stuff in it, and rolled it up into a bag and carried it with them from the north to the south so that they could, some of them wanted to help, but others wanted to just make money. Next is Thomas Greene. As far as I know, we were not related. In 1861, Greene joined the Confederate Army as a colonel in the 5th Texas Cavalry. Remember, cavalry are soldiers that ride into battle on horses. He served with distinction in the operations at Galveston, Texas, for which he was rewarded with a promotion to brigadier general in May of 1863. Francis Lubbock. This is probably the guy that the town is named after. First Texas governor in the Confederacy. Abraham Lincoln. He was the 16th President of the United States, serving from March 1861 until he was assassinated in April 1865. He led the United States through the Civil War. Dred Scott, a black slave who sued his owner for his freedom on the basis of his long residence on free soil. The ruling on the case was that he was a black slave and not a citizen, so he had no rights. So what happened here was that the slave owner took his slave to some states where slavery was not legal. And the slave sued the owner saying, "We've lived in these states where I should be a free man, and I think I'm a free man." And this is one of the black marks on the Supreme Court for ruling in this ruling against the person who was a slave and wanted to be free. General William Tecumseh Sherman. In 1864, he was heavily relied on by Lincoln. He won brilliantly in Atlanta and then basically destroyed the South. In Sherman's march, he took a 300-mile march to the sea from Atlanta, destroying everything in his path and freeing slaves. He also ravaged South Carolina. The South was in ruins as a result. And his goal there was twofold. He wanted to destroy the South's ability to make the war. If you can't make bullets and guns, you can't fight the war. Second, he wanted to crush their spirits. If they saw that you fight the North, then their armies are going to come through and destroy everything. Let's go to the vocabulary. Secede. That means to formally withdraw. So if Coach Cidio and I wanted to try, we could secede from the school and we'd take our classes and start our own school. But that's not going to work. Civil War. War between two areas in the same country. So in this case, it was the north of the country versus the south of the country. Cotton diplomacy. Withholding cotton shipments to other nations until they offered aid. So the South produced a lot of cotton, and they shipped it to Great Britain or England. And they thought that if they stopped giving England their cotton, England needed it so bad that they would send guns and ammunition in return to get more cotton back. A blockade. To block major roads or ports so that supplies cannot get to one region or state. So in the Civil War, the North put a blockade in against the South, and they sent the northern ships into southern ports, and they would shoot at any southern ship that tried to get in or out of the port. Abolition. This is ending of slavery, and people who fought for this were called abolitionists. The CSA, the Confederate States of America, that's the South in the Civil War. Unionists. Southerners who wanted to stay in the Union and work out differences over slavery in the mid-1800s. Remember, not everyone in the South owned slaves, and not everyone wanted to secede and start a new country because of slavery. Confederacy, an alliance between different groups. Emancipation Proclamation. President Abraham Lincoln's Declaration of Freedom for Slaves in areas rebelling. States' rights. Rights held by states that place limits on implied powers of the federal government over state government. So what this is saying is that the federal government or the president can't come in and tell the states how to do everything. The states have the right to choose a lot of the things that they do and to choose how they do them. And this is one of the arguments that was made after the Civil War for the cause of the Civil War. Kansas-Nebraska Act, passed in 1854, that allowed the residents of Kansas and Nebraska territories to decide whether to allow slavery. This is before the Civil War, and it kind of shows that, you know what, there might be bigger problems coming, because in this area there was a lot of fighting. People who did not want slavery to exist and people who did want slavery to exist actually ended up shooting at each other and fighting and killing people over the issue of slavery, all before the Civil War. Dred Scott decision, ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1857, in which the court determined that African Americans were not citizens and thus could not sue in federal court. And we talked about that just a second ago. And then the word enslaved, to make into or as if into a slave. This is going to be people who are held against their will, so they can't leave, and usually they have to work and do labor for the person who owns them. Causes of the Civil War. Slavery, Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the part right there that says Bloody Kansas, that is what I was talking about just a second ago, where people that wanted slaves and people that didn't want slaves were actually fighting over the issue. There was differences in the economics of the North and the South. Remember, the North had a lot of factories, and the South was a lot of plantations with slave labor. The Republican Party, which was brand new at the time, was actually created to stop the spread of slavery. Then there was the issue of state versus federal power. This is the states' rights. What can the president do and what can the president not do? What can the states do? What can the states not do? John Brown's raid. So this was a man named John Brown went and grabbed a bunch of guns from the federal government. He stole them, and he wanted to give the slaves the guns and have a slave uprising where they would fight for their own freedom. And this really scared people in both the North and the South. The Fugitive Slave Act. This is where if you're a slave in the South and you run away to the North, and they find you in the North, you by law, the northern state that you were in has to help take you back to your owner. That's the Fugitive Slave Act. Abraham Lincoln was elected. This was the last straw. As soon as that happened, states started to secede. And then remember we talked about how Abraham Lincoln was a real cool character, and he didn't want to be the first person to start the war. He wanted the South to start it if there was going to be a war. And so what he did was said, you know what, we have this fort down in the South, and we're going to keep our people there. And they got hungry. They ran out of their food. And so Abraham Lincoln told the South, he said, we're going to send a boat with food in it. Please don't attack the boat. Well, the South didn't trust that, and they attacked the fort, and they started the war. Now, both sides had different strategies on how they wanted to win the war. Let's go over some of those. The North. Their goal was to bring the southern states back. The North would win the war if they could keep the states in the Union. They wanted to blockade southern ports so that ships of the South couldn't bring supplies in or take goods out to sell. They wanted to control the Mississippi River, because remember, rivers were like big highways at the time. If you can control the Mississippi, you can control the South. They wanted to capture Richmond, which was the capital of the southern states, or the Confederacy. The South, they wanted to win recognition of their independence. If they could get other countries and then the North to say, you know what, you're a real country, then they've won, because that was their goal. They just want to be left alone. Play defense. So instead of invading the North, they just had to fight off the North and keep them out. They wanted to get European countries' help, specifically Britain and France, and this would follow the example of the Revolutionary War. So let's talk about battles. The first battle was Fort Sumter, and the Confederates captured a Union fort. I think it was in the Charleston Harbor. Then we had the Battle of Bull Run, which was also a Confederate victory, and Sabine Pass, which is a battle to control Texas ports. Then there was two battles of Galveston, and those were also battles to control Texas ports. Antietam was the bloodiest day of the Civil War. Oh, and then here's one more, the last battle of the war, Palmetto Ranch, and this is also in Texas, which occurred after General Lee surrendered. So the war is over, but it took so long to get messages out to faraway places that they didn't know the war was over, and so they fought anyway. Gettysburg. This was a turning point of the war where the Union, or the North, won, and they pushed Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army back to the South. March to the Sea. Union General Sherman marched across the South, destroying everything in his path. And this says Confederate victory, but it wasn't. It was a Union victory. They destroyed the ability for them to make war. Appomattox Courthouse. General of the Confederate Army, Robert E. Lee, surrenders to General Grant of the Union Army, and the war ends. Now, after the war, how do you put the country back together? And this is called Reconstruction. Okay, Reconstruction is the process of reuniting the United States after the Civil War and rebuilding the United States. Part of that was passing 3 amendments for rights for people who were formerly slaves. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment said that they were citizens and they had equal rights. And the 15th Amendment gave them suffrage, or the right to vote. Now remember, this was suffrage for African American men, not women. Suffrage means the right to vote. Civil rights are individual rights guaranteed by the Constitution. Juneteenth, we just did all this vocabulary, you should remember this. Juneteenth, June 19th, celebrated as the day on which the Union General Gordon Granger landed at Galveston and freed Texas slaves. Jim Crow laws, laws passed in southern states to enforce segregation. Segregation, forced separation of whites and African Americans in public. Remember, we showed you signs that said white's water fountain and black's water fountain, and you couldn't drink in the other one. That's segregation. Impeach, to bring charges against a public official or this is how you kick them out of being in the government. So you could impeach the president and kick him out of being president. Scalawags, name given to Southerners who supported Reconstruction for personal economic gain. Scalawags. Carpetbagger, Northerners who moved to the South after the Civil War. And radical Republicans, they believe that the South should be punished for the war and be forced to accept reforms. So you can listen to this review again. You can have me read it to you again, or you can go to the Quizlet at the top of the review and you can take the quiz there. I hope that you study for the test. We're taking it on Friday. If you have any questions, come see me. Thank you.